I was invited to a debate at a psychiatric hospital in London. Do psychiatric drugs do more harm than good?
I am sitting next to one of the world's leaders in terms of looking at the science and in terms of involvement with the Cochrane collaboration.
The book I published in September with a funny title, Deadly Psychiatry and Organized Denial.
I'm not selling a book.
And I don't need to declare this as a conflict of interest because everybody knows that an author earns money on his book. That's not a hidden conflict of interest.
It's a 50-second Maudsley debate here at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, which is part of King's College London. So can we have a show of hands then, please, first for people who support the motion that the long-term use of psychiatric medicines is causing more harm than good? Before the debate, the scores are, we have 126 people supporting the motion, 64 opposing the motion, and 28 abstentions.
So, if you could start now, so we're going to have the first speaker for.
So, this debate is about weighing up benefits and harms of long-term treatment of psychiatric drugs. It is tempting in such debates to entertain, use anecdote and rhetoric to win your side. I won't do that. I'm a scientist. I work at the Nordic Cochrane Center, and in Cochrane we rely on facts. So I'll give you some facts. Cochrane reviews have shown that psychiatric drugs are generally pretty ineffective. People think they're effective, and that is because the spontaneous improvement is mistaken for a drug effect. It's also because the randomized trials are pretty biased. Most of the trials are done this way. You have patients who are already in treatment with the drug. Then you have a short washout period. Then you randomize to placebo or a similar drug. That means that you introduce withdrawal symptoms in the placebo group, abstinence symptoms, a cold turkey. And that cold turkey can create depression, psychosis, and so on, which is then misinterpreted as a return of the disease. So that's a major reason why most of these trials are badly flawed. Another reason why they're flawed is that they are not adequately blinded. These drugs have conspicuous side effects. So there are studies that have shown that in most cases, doctors and patients know who is getting active drug and who is getting placebo. So there is a very important Cochrane review that in depression that only looked at trials that had something in the placebo, namely atropine, because it gives you similar side effects as the tricyclic antidepressants. And that review found an effect of only 1 on the Hamilton scale. That's nothing, because the least difference that people can perceive is 5 to 6. So 1 equals nothing. So if you put something in the placebo so that you blind your trials, you don't see an effect. Now, the trials are also short-term. We need long-term trials. There are not many of these. And I should say that the cold turkey design has actually driven some patients into suicide. Patients with schizophrenia, they committed suicide because of akathisia when they got abstinence symptoms. Now, trials in schizophrenia are also disappointing. Newer submissions to the FDA for new drugs found an effect of only 6 on the positive and negative syndrome scale. And the least clinically relevant difference is 15. So what was found was much less than what is clinically relevant. And you should remember that most of these trials were deeply flawed by cold turkey problems and inadequate blinding, which benefit the active drugs. So the real effect is even less than this. Now, the benefits of ADHD drugs is also uncertain. Whether there is a short-term effect, that is possible, but they also suffer from cold turkey and unblinding bias effects. Moreover, almost all of these trials carefully selected responders. So they randomized only people who responded to these drugs. This is a deeply flawed design. They call it an enriched design, I call it a design that makes the drug companies rich. And if there is a short-term effect on ADHD, it surely is replaced by long-term harm. There are very few long-term trials, and those that they indicate long-term harm. And animal studies clearly show that these drugs likely give permanent brain damage. This is likely the case, or at least long-term brain damage. This is likely the case for all psychotropic drugs if you use them more than a few weeks. So these drugs are incredibly harmful, and I have estimated that in people older than 65, they kill around 500,000 people annually in the USA and in Europe. Only benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, and antidepressants. They kill very, very many people. There are no beneficial effects that can justify this tremendous harm on people. So I have estimated we could get away with using only 2% of the drugs we use now, mostly for acute situations, with a firm plan for tapering off as quickly as possible. So we need new guidelines to reflect this, and we need withdrawal clinics all over the country, because very few doctors know how to withdraw patients from psychiatric drugs. That's it.
The next person is Sami Tamimi.
We are in danger of creating morbidity on a massive scale with our evidence-based use of long-term psychiatric medication, which seems to be increasing in volume. Official guidelines like NICE seem to have plenty to say about starting people on these medications, but have given advice on long-term treatment and how long to give these medications and how to help people safely withdraw. It seems that the widespread use of psychiatric medications these days is the result of good marketing and not good science. So the evidence is clear, and the big question is not whether long-term prescription does more harm than good. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Bodies like the Royal College of Psychiatrists have, I believe, a scientific and moral duty to do something. Can I just try and bring the debate back to the question of evidence? Because this isn't a debate about banning all psychiatric drugs. It's a debate about whether long-term use of psychiatric drugs is associated with more harms than benefits. And I think we have to be very careful about getting into anecdotes. This is where I think, as a clinician, the trial of n equals 1 is what I do all the time as a clinician. But when we're trying to evaluate this question, we need to return to the evidence.
Okay, so Peter Gøtzsche. Okay, so let's go on to another reply.
Yes. The N of 1 to cross over in one patient is a very bad idea in psychiatry, because when you stop the drug and get abstinence symptoms, you think that your disease has come back, and then you get back on the drug. Yeah, the psychiatrists and other doctors are pretty poor at distinguishing between whether it's a withdrawal depression or whether it's a real depression. So that's not a good design. On the other hand, it's very good to listen to the patients. I have a lot of patient views in the book I published in September with a funny title, Deadly Psychiatry and Organized Denial. And these patient views clearly, consistently tell us that the patients don't like the drugs, not even in randomized trials where the psychiatrists think that the effect is great. And then when you ask the patients in the same trial, they say they don't work. And equally many leave the trials before the trial is over on antidepressants as on placebo, which tells you everything, that on average, considering benefits and harms together, which is what this meeting is about, the patients think they don't work for depression because they leave the trials equally often on active drug as on placebo.
Okay, so
I'm not going to respond to an insulting remark that we don't know the science. I am sitting next to one of the world's leaders in terms of looking at the science and in terms of involvement with the Cochrane Collaboration.
But I'll first of all offer Peter Gøtzsche the chance to respond to the very first question, and then perhaps John Crace for the next two.
When you take patients who are already in treatment and have a short washout period of about 1 week, typically, some people will get withdrawal symptoms. And those that can then get randomized to placebo, they will still have withdrawal symptoms, and they will perhaps feel worse. whereas those who get randomized to another drug will feel relieved. I'm better now. And also withdrawal symptoms can come later than 1 week. So it's indisputable that this design introduces harm in the placebo group and bias in randomized trials. So what you should do is only to include patients where none of them were in treatment beforehand. And there is a Cochrane review in schizophrenia where many people were first episode schizophrenics, but there were also a mixture with second episode schizophrenics. But this Cochrane review is very important because the authors conclude that they are uncertain about whether antipsychotics actually work for an acute psychosis when you haven't harmed the placebo group.
And also, I'm not selling a book.
In response to the question about whether psychiatric drugs produce abnormal mental states, I think that's pretty obvious now. They work in the same way that any other things that affect your neurochemicals, so they work in similar ways to cocaine or alcohol. Or they all cause abnormal mental states, which can be helpful, certainly in the short term, can be helpful, but let's not get confused. The idea that we've got something that is called an antipsychotic, that it works specifically with a disease process called psychosis, or that we have a disease process called depression and we have something that's an antidepressant, that is the result of good marketing. There is no science to suggest that there is any such thing as an antipsychotic or an antidepressant.
Okay, Alan, and then...
It is not correct that Alan Young declared his conflict of interest in the BMJ. He declared none. So I contacted the editors and said, how come this man has not declared his numerous conflicts of interest? So they changed the BMJ paper. I have a version of both PDFs. So it is bluntly dishonest to say he declared his conflicts. He didn't. And my book, I have to mention it because there are 900 references and people accuse me for not giving the 900 references in the BMJ article. I can't do that. So I have to tell you all the evidence is there. And I don't need to declare this as a conflict of interest because everybody knows that an author earns money on his book. That's not a hidden conflict of interest.
Okay, so Peter, you now have 2 minutes. Peter.
First of all, I'm terribly sorry I used the word schizophrenics. I never do this. Patients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, which on top of that is often... So I only did it because I was pressed at this debate. I agree with you completely. Now, about forced treatment, I'm going to work very hard in this world to put a ban on forced admission to hospital and forced treatment. It kills an enormous amount of patients, although despite that they are begging not to get, they are forced upon them. And according to the United Convention on Handicapped, it should be banned in countries. So I'm going to work on that. The UK has signed this convention, so you need to ban forced treatment by law. You're obliged to do that according to United Nations. Now, about whether these drugs do more harm than good, that is pretty obvious, and we have heard about that lithium reduces suicides. Actually, the Cochrane authors on that report are very careful about not concluding too much based on very few events, and they say that just 1 or 2 negative trials will around the result completely. So whether lithium reduces suicide, but we know that antidepressants kill a % of people who are older than 65. They fall. Many other psychotropic drugs lead to falls. So this is one reason why they kill so incredibly many people. No amount of benefit can make up tremendous harm. That's why we need to focus the next 10 years on people off these horrible drugs. Thank you.
Was 126 for, 64 against, 28 abstentions. We've swelled our ranks somewhat. After the debate, we now have 136 for, 66 against and 34 abstentions. So in fact all three categories have actually increased their vote.